Ethan Winters stood in the corner of the elegantly decorated dining room, the soft glow of the chandelier casting a warm light over the gathering. It was a night to celebrate. Their friends from the country club had come over for dinner, and laughter rang through the air like a symphony of joy. Yet, for Ethan, the atmosphere felt more like a funeral dirge, one that heralded the death of his spirit. At 17, Ethan was not what one might call conventionally handsome. His facial features were unique, a tapestry of asymmetry that many would deem unattractive. His nose was slightly crooked, his cheekbone higher on one side, and his lips bore a scar from a childhood accident. His appearance had always set him apart, but it was the disdainful glances from his parents that truly cut deep. He had grown accustomed to the whispers and stares from strangers, but hearing his own mother and father mock him was a wound that would never heal. "Richard, I can't believe he wore that to school." Margaret's voice rang out, laced with laughter. "It's as if he's trying to draw attention to his unique features." Ethan's heart sank as he peeked around the corner of the room. His father, a tall man with an air of authority, leaned back in his chair, his laughter booming like thunder. "Maybe he thinks he's an artist," he chortled. "But the only thing he's painting is a portrait of shame for this family." The laughter of their friends filled the room like a cruel melody, and Ethan felt his cheeks burn with an overwhelming mix of anger and humiliation. He wanted to scream, to burst into the room and confront them, but the weight of their judgment held him in place. Instead, he retreated into the shadows, gripping the edge of the table as if it were his only lifeline. "Have you seen his latest painting?" One of their friends chimed in, attempting to steer the conversation away. "I hear it's interesting." "Interesting," Margaret scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "More like a cry for help. I just wish he'd focus on something more respectable, like sports or academics. You know, something that doesn't involve embarrassing us." Ethan's vision blurred with tears, but he quickly blinked them away, refusing to let his parents see him break. He had always been the outcast, the one who didn't fit into their perfect world. Art was his sanctuary, a place where he could express himself without fear of judgment. But it seemed that even his passion was a source of shame for them. As the laughter continued to echo in his ears, Ethan turned away from the door, retreating to his bedroom. The walls of his sanctuary were adorned with his paintings, each one a piece of his soul laid bare. In those moments of creation, he felt free, transcending the hurt and rejection he faced daily. But tonight, the sting of his parents' words lingered like a bitter aftertaste. Later that night, as the echoes of laughter faded and the house settled into a heavy silence, Ethan found himself standing in front of his parents' bedroom door. He could hear their muffled voices through the wood, discussing mundane topics, as if their earlier remarks hadn't shredded his heart to pieces. It was now or never. He had to confront them. With a deep breath, he knocked gently, his hand trembling. "Who is it?" Margaret called from inside, her tone sharp. "It's me, Ethan," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Can we talk?" There was a brief pause before the door creaked open, revealing a surprised Richard. "What do you want, son?" His expression was a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. Ethan stepped into the room, the familiar scent of lavender and aged wood enveloping him. "I want to talk about what you said earlier," he began, his heart pounding in his chest. "I want you to know how it felt to hear you laugh about me, to hear you call me a shame." Richard crossed his arms, his posture rigid. "You need to understand, Ethan. We only want what's best for you. You're not a child anymore. You have to start taking life seriously." "Taking life seriously?" Ethan echoed, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You think it's serious to mock your own son? To belittle his passion?" Margaret, who had been sitting on the edge of the bed, looked between them, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and fear. "Ethan, we didn't mean it like that," she finally spoke, her voice soft but lacking conviction. "It was just a joke. I thought you'd laugh with us." "Laugh with you?" Ethan shouted, his voice breaking. "How can I laugh when you both make me feel like I don't belong in this family? I just want your love and acceptance. But instead, all I get is rejection." Richard's face hardened, his jaw clenched. "You bring shame to this family, Ethan. You need to understand that. We have a reputation to uphold." "I don't want to be a part of your reputation," Ethan shot back, tears streaming down his cheeks now. "I want to be me. Isn't that enough?" "Enough." Richard's voice was cold as ice. "You think being yourself is enough? Look at you. You're different, and different doesn't fit in our world. You need to think about the family name." Margaret's silence spoke volumes. She sat there, her eyes downcast, guilt etched across her face. Ethan could see the regret swirling in her gaze, but it was drowned out by Richard's harsh words. "That's it, isn't it?" Ethan said, his voice trembling. "You don't care about me at all. You only care about what people think. Maybe it's better if I just leave." "Leave?" Richard's expression morphed into one of disbelief. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I am," Ethan replied, his heart racing with determination. "I'll pack my things and go. You'll see, you don't have to worry about me anymore. I won't be a burden to you." "Ethan, wait," Margaret began, but he was already moving, storming out of the room and heading to his own. He felt the world closing in around him, the walls of his childhood home suddenly feeling like a prison. As he gathered his belongings, shoving clothes and art supplies into a worn backpack, a sense of liberation washed over him. He was breaking free from the chains that had bound him for so long, but beneath that liberation lay a deep, gnawing sadness. He was leaving behind the only home he had ever known, chasing after the acceptance that had always eluded him. With one final glance around the room, he stepped out into the cool night air, the door clicking shut behind him. He didn't know where he would go or what the future held, but one thing was certain. He would no longer be defined by his parents' rejection. He would forge his own path and become someone they would be proud of. As he walked away from the only life he had ever known, Ethan whispered a silent vow to himself. "I will rise from this. You will see what I can become." Years passed in a blur for Ethan Winters, the young man who had once been the object of his parents' scorn. The torment of his childhood lingered like a shadow, but it served as both a catalyst and a backdrop for his transformation. In the quiet solitude of his studio apartment, Ethan immersed himself in his work, channeling his pain into the beauty industry. He sculpted his brand with the same care an artist would use to mold clay, focusing on self-acceptance and redefining the standards of beauty that had once ostracized him. His small line of beauty products, crafted with wholesome ingredients and free from the toxicity that often plagued the industry, began to gain traction. Ethereal Essence, he named it, a nod to the idea that beauty could be something otherworldly, something that transcended mere appearances. Ethan poured his heart into each product, instilling them with messages of empowerment and acceptance. He wanted to reach those who felt unworthy, just as he had felt in his parents' eyes. As the years rolled on, the brand exploded onto the market. Ethan became a well-known figure, gracing magazine covers and television interviews, always advocating for authenticity in a world that thrived on filters. He was relentless, not only in promoting his products but also in his mission to change perceptions about beauty. Yet, amid the accolades and applause, a hollow ache remained in his chest, a reminder of the love he had never received from the two people who should have given it unconditionally. One evening, standing in front of the large mirror that dominated his modern loft, Ethan scrutinized his reflection. The man staring back was a far cry from the boy who had fled his childhood home. His features, still unique, now held an air of confidence and poise. The scars on his face were no longer a source of shame. They were badges of survival, symbols of his journey. He had sculpted himself into someone successful, someone who had transformed his pain into power. But even as he admired the man he had become, a familiar wave of anger surfaced. The memories of his parents' laughter at his expense echoed in his mind. They had rejected him, disowned him as if he were a mere mistake. He clenched his fists, feeling the heat of resentment rising within him. Ethan had built a life that many would envy, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed closure. He needed to confront them, to see the look on their faces when they realized the son they had scorned had become something great. He picked up his phone and stared at the screen, contemplating a call that could change everything. Instead, he scrolled through the photos of his past. The young boy with a paintbrush in hand, the laughter of childhood friends, and the haunting images of his parents at their dinner parties, oblivious to the damage they inflicted. The urge to call them faded into a simmering resolve. Tomorrow, he whispered to himself, I'll go home. The night before his planned visit, Ethan lay awake, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The walls of his apartment, adorned with his artwork, felt stifling now. He had spent so long building a persona, yet he was terrified of the confrontation to come. What did he want from his parents? Was it revenge that fueled him, or was it the hope of reconciliation? He turned over in bed, the sheets twisted around him like the conflicting emotions in his heart. The clock ticked steadily, the sound echoing in the silence. What do I really want? He murmured into the darkness. To show them how far I've come? Or to make them feel the pain they caused me? The lines between vengeance and redemption blurred, and he felt lost in that fog. Perhaps he wanted them to see the man he had become, to understand the depths of their rejection, but also to let them know that he had risen above it. He wanted them to know that he had succeeded in a world that had once made him feel like a failure. Finally, the dawn broke, casting a soft light through his window. Ethan dressed methodically, each article of clothing a reminder of his journey. He chose a crisp white shirt, tailored pants, and polished shoes, an outfit that screamed success. He looked in the mirror once more, adjusting his hair and straightening his collar. Today is the day, he said firmly. The drive back to his childhood home was surreal. The familiar roads felt foreign, each turn stirring up memories that he had long buried. As he approached the small town, he noticed how time had changed the landscape. The once vibrant trees lining the streets were now overgrown, their branches heavy with neglect. The houses he passed, including his own, seemed like relics of a different life, faded and forgotten. When Ethan finally arrived at the front of his childhood home, he hesitated. The house stood there, an old friend that had turned into a stranger. The paint was peeling, and the yard was unkempt, a stark contrast to the pristine memories he had of it. He took a deep breath, his heart racing. This was it. He was about to confront the people who had shaped his life in ways they could never understand. He stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of his past pressing on his shoulders. The door loomed before him, a barrier between two worlds, the boy he had once been and the man he was now. Gathering his courage, he raised his hand and knocked. The sound echoed, a hollow thud that resonated with his uncertainty. Moments felt like hours until the door creaked open, revealing his mother, Margaret. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she took in the sight of her son. "Ethan?" she breathed, her voice a mixture of shock and confusion. "Hello, Mom," he replied, keeping his tone even despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. She stepped back, allowing him to enter, and he felt the familiar yet foreign atmosphere of the home wash over him. The living room was unchanged, filled with the same furniture, albeit covered in a layer of dust. "I didn't expect you," she stammered, her voice faltering as she searched his face for answers. "I didn't expect to come back, either," Ethan admitted, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "But I needed to see you and Dad." Margaret's expression shifted to one of concern. "Your father, he's not well, Ethan. He's been struggling," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He felt a pang of something. Was it sympathy or anger? "I'm here now," he said, forcing the words out as he tried to steady his breathing. "I need to talk to both of you." "Of course," she replied, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Let me get him." As she turned to call for Richard, Ethan glanced around the room, memories flooding back. The laughter, the arguments, the moments of fleeting happiness. They all felt distant yet painfully close. He felt like a ghost in his own home, lost in the echoes of the past. Richard appeared moments later, confusion etched on his face as he took in the sight of his son. "Ethan?" he said, his voice low and cautious. "What are you doing here?" I came to talk, Ethan responded, his heart pounding. We need to talk about everything. Richard's brow furrowed, and he exchanged a glance with Margaret, who stood nervously at his side. What's there to talk about? He asked, his defensiveness creeping in. Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation that lay ahead. Everything. The past, the rejection, the pain. I need you to understand how your words shaped my life. Richard opened his mouth to respond but then closed it, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The air in the room thickened with tension, and Ethan realized that this was only the beginning of the reckoning he had long awaited. Ethan Winters stood at the threshold of his childhood home, the place that had once been a sanctuary filled with warmth and laughter, now felt like a ghostly shell, echoing the pain of his past. The overgrown garden, once lovingly tended by his mother, now resembled a wild jungle, with weeds choking the life out of the flowers. The paint on the front door was chipped, and the welcome mat was faded and frayed, as if time itself had conspired to reflect the neglect he felt from his family. He hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. Memories flooded back, his mother's soft hands guiding him through his first art project, the laughter shared over family dinners, and the gut-wrenching moment his father had disowned him. Ethan closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to ground himself in the present as waves of anger and sorrow washed over him. He had come so far, built a life that he had once only dreamed of, yet here he was, standing at the very place that had caused his descent into darkness. Taking a deep breath, he raised his hand and knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the stillness of the air, and he waited, a tempest of emotions swirling within him. Moments felt like hours, and just as he was about to turn away, the door creaked open, revealing his mother, Margaret. She stood there, eyes wide, mouth slightly agape, as if she had seen a ghost. "Ethan?" she whispered, her voice barely breaking the silence. "Hello, Mom," he replied, his voice steady yet laced with an undertone of vulnerability. Margaret's gaze roamed over him, taking in the man he had become, tall, confident, and undeniably successful. But in that moment, beneath the surface of her surprise, Ethan could see the flicker of recognition, the shadow of regret. "Oh my," she stammered, stepping aside to allow him entry. "You've changed so much. Come in, please." As he crossed the threshold, a wave of nostalgia washed over him. The familiar scent of the old wood and the faint aroma of something baking in the kitchen brought back memories he thought he had buried. But the air was thick with unspoken words, and an awkward silence enveloped them. I didn't know if you'd ever come back," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper as she closed the door behind him. Ethan glanced around the living room, filled with outdated furniture and dusty family photos. "I needed to," he replied, his heart racing. "I wanted to see you." "Your father is in the other room," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He'll be surprised to see you." "Surprised? That's one way to put it," he muttered under his breath, though he couldn't help but feel a twinge of apprehension at the thought of facing Richard. Margaret's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she reached out, placing a tentative hand on his arm. "Ethan, But before she could finish, Richard entered the room, his expression morphing from confusion to shock. "Ethan?" he exclaimed, his voice rising in disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "Hello, Dad," Ethan said, the weight of years pressing down on him as he stood before the man who had cast him aside. Richard's brow furrowed, and he crossed his arms defensively. I didn't expect you to come back. After everything." Ethan clenched his fists, feeling the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You didn't expect me? Or didn't want me here?" Margaret stepped between them, her voice rising slightly. "Richard, let's not do this right now. Ethan's here and we should—" "No, let him talk," Richard interrupted, his tone sharp. "What do you want, Ethan? To gloat about your success? To show us what we missed out on?" Ethan's pulse quickened. "I want to understand," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "I want to understand why you rejected me." Richard's face hardened, and for a moment, silence reigned in the room. The air was thick with tension, and Margaret looked between the two men, her expression a mixture of fear and sadness. "It was for your own good," Richard finally said, his voice clipped. "We didn't want you to grow up thinking you were special when you clearly weren't." Ethan felt as though he had been struck. "Not special? You mean because I didn't fit your version of perfection?" He took a step closer, his voice rising with emotion. "I was a child, Dad. I needed your support, not your disdain." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she glanced at her husband. "Richard, please. Don't defend me, Margaret," he snapped, turning back to Ethan. "You think I wanted to hurt you? I had to make tough choices." "Tough choices?" Ethan shot back, his voice shaking with rage. "You chose to abandon me, to make me feel like a freak. You think that was tough? You have no idea what kind of pain that caused." Richard's face flushed, and he opened his mouth to respond. But the words died on his lips as he struggled to find a way to justify his actions. Margaret stepped forward, her voice softening. "Ethan, we were scared. We didn't know how to handle your uniqueness. We thought we were protecting you." "Protecting me?" Ethan echoed, incredulous. "By making me feel worthless? By tearing me apart in front of your friends? You think that was protection?" "I regret it," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I regret every moment I stood by while your father treated you that way. I should have fought for you." The vulnerability in her voice pierced through Ethan's anger, and for a moment, he felt the walls he had built around his heart begin to tremble. "Why didn't you? You had the chance to stand up for me, Mom. You could have said something." "I know," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was weak. I was afraid of what others would think, afraid of losing your father's love." Ethan shook his head, feeling the weight of her words. "So, you chose his approval over your son?" Richard shifted uncomfortably, the tension in the room palpable. "I thought I was doing what was best," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I wanted you to be strong, to face the world without being soft." "By breaking me?" Ethan replied, his voice rising again. "You didn't make me strong. You made me resentful. You pushed me away, and in doing so, you lost me." Silence fell again, and the three of them stood there, the reality of their fractured family settling heavily in the air. Ethan's heart raced. The confrontation he had envisioned for years was finally happening, yet it felt like a hollow victory. The anger that had fueled his transformation now felt like a double-edged sword. "Ethan, please," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "We can fix this. We can start over." "Can we?" Ethan asked bitterly. "After all these years, can we really just pretend like everything is fine?" Richard stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "I can't change the past, but I can try to be better. I want to understand you, son. I want to know the man you've become." Ethan met his father's gaze, searching for sincerity amid the confusion and hurt. "You want to know me? Then stop hiding behind your pride. Stop pretending like you did what was right when it was just easier for you." Margaret took a deep breath, her eyes locked on Ethan. "We have so much to talk about. I want to hear your story, your dreams. I want you to know how proud I am of you, even if I didn't show it." Ethan felt a flicker of something. Hope, perhaps. But the scars of the past were deep, and healing would take time. "Proud? You have no idea what I've gone through to get here." "I know," Margaret said softly, "and I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Ethan felt the anger slowly begin to recede, replaced by something more profound, an aching desire for connection, for understanding. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," he said finally, his voice steady, "but I'm willing to try, if you are." Richard nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I want that too, Ethan. I want us to be a family again. I want to know you." Ethan looked between his parents, feeling the fragility of the moment. It was a beginning, a glimmer of hope on a long road ahead, but it was a start. And for the first time in years, he felt the possibility of healing, even amid the scars. Ethan sat at the dinner table, the flickering candlelight illuminating the strained atmosphere. The aroma of roasted chicken filled the air, but it felt heavy and suffocating, much like the tension that hung between him and his parents. Richard, his father, sat at the head of the table, his demeanor as rigid as the fine china beneath his hands. Margaret, his mother, fidgeted with her napkin, casting nervous glances between Ethan and Richard. "Ethan, you've done well for yourself," Richard began, his voice a mixture of forced pride and genuine surprise. "Your business, it's impressive. I never thought you'd amount to much after, well, everything." Ethan's heart raced at those words. They stung with the weight of past rejections, a reminder of the years he spent seeking validation from the man across the table. "You mean after you disowned me?" he replied coolly, his gaze steady on Richard. "It's hard to forget that." Richard's jaw clenched, and he looked away, the silence stretching like a taut wire. "That was a long time ago, Ethan. We all make mistakes. What matters is that you're here now," he replied, attempting to steer the conversation away from the uncomfortable truth. "No, what matters is how those mistakes shaped my life." Ethan shot back, his voice rising slightly. "Your rejection didn't just hurt me, Dad. It defined me. I lost years of my life trying to prove that I was worthy of your love." Margaret finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Ethan, your father thought he was protecting you. He believed that." "Believed what, Mom?" Ethan interjected, his frustration boiling over. "That I needed to conform to some twisted version of beauty for acceptance? That I had to hide who I was?" Richard's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "I did what I thought was best for you. You were different, Ethan. I wanted to prepare you for the world. People can be cruel." A bitter laugh escaped Ethan's lips. "Cruel? You mean like you were to me? Like the way you mocked me in front of your friends? You think I didn't hear you? You think I didn't see their faces when they laughed?" "Enough!" Richard slammed his hand on the table, rattling the dishes. "You don't understand. You think it's easy for a father to watch his son struggle? To see him ridiculed?" Ethan's breath hitched, the air thick with unresolved pain. "You think I wanted to struggle? I wanted my father's love, Dad. Instead, I got your disdain. I left because I had to find my own worth. I had to learn to love myself when you refused to." Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she watched the exchange unfold. "Ethan, please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "We were wrong. We should have supported you. I should have said something, done something. But I was afraid." "Afraid of what exactly?" Ethan challenged, his voice low and intense. "Afraid of being judged for having a son who didn't fit your ideal? Afraid of what the neighbors would say?" Richard leaned back in his chair, the fight draining from his posture. "It wasn't just about appearances, Ethan. It was about the life we wanted for you. We had dreams for you. Dreams that didn't include me." Ethan interrupted, his heart racing. "You wanted a trophy son, someone who fit into your perfect little world. But I'm not that person, and I never will be." Margaret finally broke down, her voice barely a whisper. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. I wish things had been different. I wish I had been stronger to stand by you. I didn't know how to handle it." Ethan's anger flickered, replaced by a deep-seated sadness. "You didn't know how to handle me," he muttered, looking down at his plate. "But I'm not a child anymore. I've built a life for myself. I found success in a world that once rejected me." Richard's eyes narrowed again, but this time, his expression shifted from anger to something more vulnerable. "Success doesn't erase the past, Ethan. You're still that boy who what?" Ethan snapped, rising from his chair. "Who wore his heart on his sleeve? Who dared to be different? You think I haven't carried that hurt with me? I've turned it into something powerful, something beautiful. But I still ache for the love I never received from you." The air crackled between them, the weight of unspoken words pressing down like a heavy fog. Margaret reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it over Ethan's. "Please, can't we just talk without this hostility? I want to understand. I want to know how you truly feel." Ethan pulled his hand away, the gesture more instinctive than deliberate. "You want to understand? You want to know how I truly feel?" he echoed, his voice rising again. "I feel like a stranger in my own home. I feel like a ghost, trying to reach out to a family that never wanted me." "Ethan, that's not true," Margaret exclaimed, desperation creeping into her voice. "We loved you, we didn't know how to show it." "Love isn't just a word, Mom," he said, his heart aching with the weight of their history. "It's actions, support, acceptance. You didn't love me when it mattered the most. You let me slip away." Richard looked down, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as if he were trying to anchor himself to reality. "You've achieved so much," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I didn't want to admit that I was wrong. I didn't want to see you suffer." "Then why didn't you try to reach out?" Ethan pressed, feeling a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Why didn't you come looking for me? You let me go, and then you pretended like I never existed." Silence enveloped the room, the weight of their shared pain hanging in the air. Margaret wiped away a tear, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Ethan, I wish I could turn back time. I wish I could relive those moments and make different choices." "Wishing doesn't change the past," Ethan replied, his tone softer now but still laced with hurt. "It doesn't erase the scars you left on me." Richard's expression darkened again, his defenses rising. "You talk about scars like they're my fault. But you were stubborn, Ethan. You chose to leave. You chose to turn your back on us. Because I had to. You pushed me away." Ethan's voice cracked, the rawness of his emotions spilling over. "I needed to find my worth outside of your expectations. I needed to become someone you could never have imagined." Margaret's voice broke the tension, soft and pleading. "Ethan, please, let's not fight. I want to understand your journey. I want to hear about your success and how you've changed." Ethan looked at her, searching for sincerity in her eyes. "You think my success is enough to erase the hurt?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You think I'm just going to forget everything? I'm still that boy who stood alone in the shadows, longing for love." Richard sighed, the fight leaving him once more. "Then tell us how we can make this right," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "What do you want from us?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. What did he want? Did he want revenge? Did he want closure? Or did he simply want the love that had eluded him for so long? The confusion swirled within him, and he felt more lost than ever. "I want to feel like I belong," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to feel like I'm part of this family. But how can I when you both turned your backs on me?" As the tension simmered in the air, Ethan felt the weight of his emotions crashing down on him like an unrelenting wave. He stood, not knowing what to do next. The dinner table, once a symbol of familial warmth, felt more like a battlefield, and he was too exhausted to continue fighting. With one last look at his parents, he turned and stormed out of the room, the door slamming shut behind him. Outside, the night air hit him like a splash of cold water, and he leaned against the porch railing, trying to steady himself. The tears he had held back began to flow freely, the ache in his heart raw and unyielding. He had sought closure, but instead, he felt more lost than ever, the echoes of their confrontation haunting him as he stepped into the darkness of the night. Ethan sat in his car, the engine humming softly as the evening light cast long shadows over the cracked pavement of the driveway. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, and stared at the familiar house. The house that had once been his home, now a ghost of his childhood filled with echoes of laughter that had turned to disdain. The anger that had fueled his journey for years now felt like a heavy stone in his chest. As the memories surged up, he felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over him. He remembered the moments of rejection, the sharp words hurled at him like weapons, his father's laughter at the dinner party, the way it had twisted like a knife in his heart. Was this the moment he had longed for? A moment of confrontation? Or was it something deeper he sought? Ethan's mind raced as he thought about the revenge he had meticulously planned. He had built a successful life, a life designed to provoke a reaction from those who had scorned him. But now, sitting in the car, he started to question the nature of that reaction. Was it satisfaction he craved? Or was it simply a desperate need for acceptance? With a deep breath, Ethan turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but he didn't move. Instead, he leaned back in the seat, his thoughts swirling. He recalled his mother's startled face when she had opened the door to him earlier. Behind her shock lay an ocean of regret, one that mirrored his own. "Maybe they don't deserve me," he murmured to himself, though the words felt hollow. He closed his eyes and visualized the man he had become, the entrepreneur, the visionary, the one who had turned rejection into a brand. But beneath that exterior was a boy still longing for the love of his parents. After a moment of hesitation, Ethan made a decision. He would not leave this encounter with just anger. He would confront them, yes, but he would also show them the man he had become. He wanted them to see beyond the scars, beyond the success. He wanted them to understand the pain they had caused, but also the journey he had undertaken. Ethan stepped out of the car, the cool air biting against his skin. He took a few steps towards the house, each footfall echoing with the weight of his resolve. As he reached the front porch, he hesitated once more. Memories flooded back. The joy of playing in the yard, the warmth of family gatherings, and the deep-seated pain of being different. He raised his hand to knock, but just then, the sound of raised voices drifted through the open window. Curiosity piqued. Ethan paused, straining to listen. The argument inside was heated, filled with emotions that felt familiar yet foreign. "I can't believe you said that, Richard. After all this time, you still don't understand." His mother's voice rang out, laced with frustration. "It's not that simple, Margaret. You think I wanted it to be this way." Richard's tone was defensive, but there was an underlying current of vulnerability. Ethan's heart raced. He pressed his ear against the door, feeling a mix of dread and intrigue. "Ethan's not a monster. He's our son. You need to accept that." Margaret's voice cracked, and Ethan could almost visualize the tears in her eyes. "Accept what? That we failed? That we raised a son who doesn't fit our ideal? You think I wanted to be ashamed of him?" Richard shot back, the bitterness in his words stinging like a slap. Ethan's breath hitched. He had expected anger, accusations, but this was different. There was something raw and unfiltered in their exchange. He felt as though he were eavesdropping on a deep-seated family secret, one that could explain the years of rejection he had endured. "Do you think I wanted to feel this way?" Margaret's voice trembled, a mix of anger and deep sorrow. "He's our son, Richard. We adopted him because we wanted a family. I wanted him to have everything, the love, the acceptance. But how could we give him that when we couldn't even accept ourselves?" Ethan's heart raced as he processed her words. Adopted? He had always known he was different, but he had never considered this possibility. The realization began to settle in, intertwining with his anger and pain. Then why didn't we show him love? Why did we push him away? Richard's voice softened, and Ethan could hear the struggle within him. "I thought I was protecting him from the world, protecting us from the shame." Ethan stepped back from the door, his mind racing. The pieces began to fit together, but it felt like a puzzle of emotions that he wasn't ready to solve. He had come here seeking vengeance, but now he was confronted with a truth that turned everything he thought he knew upside down. For the first time, he understood that his parents' actions were rooted in their insecurities. They had feared judgment, and in their fear, they had hurt the one person they were supposed to love unconditionally. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped back towards the door, his heart pounding. He had come to confront them, to unleash the storm of his pain, but now he felt a shift within. Instead of anger, he felt a burgeoning empathy. He raised his hand and knocked firmly on the door, the sound resonating through the air like a final call. Silence fell inside. The argument abruptly halted. "Ethan?" Margaret's voice quivered as she opened the door, her eyes wide with shock. Richard stood behind her, his expression shifting from surprise to apprehension. "Can we talk?" Ethan's voice was steady, but inside, his heart raced. He was no longer just the boy seeking vengeance. He was a man ready to confront the complexities of love, acceptance, and the scars that ran deeper than skin. As they stood in the doorway, the air thick with tension and unspoken words, Ethan knew that this was the moment of reckoning. He would face his parents, not just as their son but as someone who had endured and survived. It was time to peel back the layers of pain, to reveal the truth that lay beneath, both his and theirs. "Please," he continued, his voice softer, "I need you to understand." And with those words, Ethan stepped over the threshold, ready to confront the past and potentially reshape the future. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that healing could begin. Ethan stood outside his childhood home, the sun setting behind him, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. He could hear muffled voices coming from inside, and with every passing moment, the weight of his memories pressed down on him like a heavy fog. It was a strange feeling, returning to the place that had once been his sanctuary but had become a prison of rejection. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was about to unfold. As he approached the door, the tension in the air thickened. He hesitated for a moment, heart racing, before finally knocking. The sound echoed through the quiet house, and soon after, his mother, Margaret, opened the door. Her eyes widened in disbelief, taking in the man standing before her, dressed impeccably, exuding an air of confidence that had been absent in his teenage years. "Ethan?" she whispered, as if speaking his name could somehow bridge the chasm that had formed between them. "Hello, Mother," he replied, his voice steady yet strained with the weight of unspoken words. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The atmosphere inside was charged with an awkward blend of surprise and hesitation. The living room was the same, yet different. The furniture slightly rearranged, the wallpaper faded, but the memories flooded back, each one more potent than the last. "Sit down, please," she said, gesturing toward the couch. Ethan complied, sinking into the cushions, feeling both familiar and alien in his own home. Margaret hovered nearby, unsure of what to say, her eyes darting around as if searching for the right words. Their silence was punctuated only by the distant sounds of the television, the mundane backdrop contrasting sharply with the emotional turmoil swirling within them. "I can't believe you're here," she finally said, breaking the silence. "We thought we'd lost you forever." Ethan forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "I've been gone a long time. It's hard to forget how things were." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Just then, Richard entered the room, his expression shifting from surprise to guarded wariness upon seeing his son. "Ethan," Richard said, his voice a mix of defensiveness and confusion. "What are you doing here?" The tension escalated, and Ethan could feel the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the confrontation that had loomed over him for years. "I came to talk," Ethan replied, his gaze unwavering, "to confront you about everything." Richard crossed his arms, a defensive posture that Ethan recognized all too well. "About what? The past is the past. You had the chance to make something of yourself. Why dredge up old wounds? Because those wounds never healed." Ethan shot back, his voice rising. "You don't get to dismiss the pain you caused me just because you've chosen to forget it." Margaret, caught in the middle, looked back and forth between them, her brow furrowed with concern. "Can we please try to talk without raising our voices? This isn't helping." Ethan took a deep breath, attempting to rein in his emotions. "I need you both to understand how your rejection affected me," he said, his voice steadier now. "You laughed at me, mocked me for how I looked. I carry those scars with me every day." Richard's face hardened. "It was tough love, Ethan. We wanted you to be strong, to face the world. It's not our fault you took it the wrong way." Ethan felt a surge of anger. Tough love? Is that what you call it? Felt more like a betrayal. "I was your son, and all I wanted was your acceptance." He paused, the memories flooding back. Moments of isolation, of feeling like an outsider in his own family. "But instead, you pushed me away." Just as the conversation reached a boiling point, Ethan caught a glimpse of Margaret's face, a mix of regret and sorrow. "Ethan," she finally said, her voice trembling, "I wish I could take back those moments. I wish I could have been stronger for you." Ethan looked at her, searching for sincerity in her eyes. "But why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you stand up for me?" "I was afraid," she admitted, tears glistening in her eyes. "Afraid of what others would think. I thought if I could make you fit into the mold, it would be better for all of us. But I see now how wrong I was." Richard's expression softened for just a moment, vulnerability breaking through his hardened exterior. "We made mistakes, Ethan," he said quietly. "But we did it out of fear, not hate. We didn't know how to handle the situation." Before Ethan could respond, he heard a faint sound coming from the kitchen, an argument escalating between his parents. Their voices, usually so controlled, were now raw and unfiltered. He stood up, curiosity piqued, and moved closer to the doorway, straining to hear. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine." Margaret's voice cracked, filled with emotion. "We adopted him because we couldn't have children. And now we're ashamed of him because he doesn't fit our ideal? Don't bring that up now," Richard snapped. "It doesn't change anything. He's a reminder of our failures, of what we wanted and couldn't have." Ethan's heart raced as he absorbed their words. Adopted? He had always suspected something was different, but this revelation sent shockwaves through him. The pain he had felt throughout his life suddenly had a new context. He took a step back, processing the truth that had just been laid bare. Unable to contain himself, Ethan burst into the kitchen. "What do you mean I'm a reminder of your failures?" he shouted, his voice echoing against the walls. "You think I'm the problem? I'm just your son." Margaret spun around, her eyes wide with shock. "Ethan, we didn't mean it like that. We were just—" "No," he interrupted, the anger boiling over. "You've been ashamed of me since the day I was born, and now I find out that I'm not even your biological child? How can I possibly reconcile with that?" Richard's face paled as he struggled to find the right words. "Ethan, please, let us explain. We loved you, even when we didn't know how to show it. I've been battling cancer," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted you to see me like this. I never wanted to admit how much I've regretted how I treated you." The revelation hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. Ethan felt the anger start to dissipate, replaced by a wave of confusion and sorrow. "You're sick?" he asked, suddenly feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "And you never told me?" "I wanted to protect you," Richard said, his voice breaking. "But I see now that I've only caused more harm. I've never forgiven myself for how I treated you, and I'm sorry." Ethan stood there, grappling with the complexity of their shared pain. In that moment, he realized that their lives had been intertwined in ways he had never understood. They were not just a family divided by anger. They were a family bound by secrets, regrets, and a desperate need for acceptance. Slowly, he stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking as the walls of resentment began to crumble. "I've spent years trying to be someone you would be proud of," he confessed, his voice trembling. "But maybe I need to start by accepting who I am, and that includes you both." Margaret reached out, her hands trembling as she took Ethan's. "We're so proud of you, Ethan. We always have been. We just didn't know how to show it." Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he looked at them, the weight of their shared history crashing down around them. In that moment, he understood that healing would take time, but the first step had been taken. Richard stepped forward, his eyes filled with remorse. "Can we start over? Can we try to be a family again?" Ethan nodded, his heart aching yet hopeful. "I think I'd like that," he said softly. As he embraced his parents, the scars of the past began to fade, replaced by a fragile yet growing bond. A bond that could withstand the trials of their shared history. In the midst of their pain, they found a flicker of hope, a chance to reclaim the love that had once been lost.